My name is Craig Reynolds. I am the museum director here, and I personally want to thank all of you for attending this evening and continuing to support what we do here at the museum. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and so I want to welcome those of you who have been with us before back, and welcome all of you who might be visiting us for the first time. We are very proud to be working with Historic Richmond in continuing partnerships as we move forward in our shared interests in the community here, and with programs that we're doing this summer, which will culminate in an exhibition that we will be doing this summer addressing infill design in Richmond's historic neighborhoods. So watch out for that program this summer. Additionally, I want to let everyone know that here at the Branch Museum we are celebrating April as Design Month, RVA. Design Month RVA is a program we are doing in conjunction with Modern Richmond Tour, and I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate all the things that Modern Richmond is doing and their partnership with us. And Calder's lecture here tonight is a sort of kickoff in some ways for us here at the museum for our programming around Design Month RVA. And lastly, I just want to remind all of you, many of you have heard this from me already, but we at the museum are facing a deadline of April 15th. And it's not the IRS, it is our charter membership deadline. Many of you, I know, are already charter members. If you're not a charter member, I'm happy to talk with you after tonight's program about becoming a charter member. Please don't hesitate to chat with me. I'd love to talk with you one-on-one before you leave here tonight. So with that, I'd like to welcome Cyan, who, again, I'm very proud to be working with Historic Richmond and the wonderful things that Cyan and her talented team are doing here in Richmond. Cyan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Craig. At the branch again for the second in our 2016 lecture series. My name is Cyan Crump. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Richmond, and we're so pleased to see so many of you here tonight. Tonight we are very excited to bring you together with the Commonwealth's preeminent architectural historian for a look at Richmond's evolving downtown architecture and how its varied nature repeatedly has referenced classical elements and ancient precedent in architectural compositions, both complex and modern. Many of us work in downtown Richmond in buildings both old and new. Perhaps we drive to work, our perspective shaped by the traffic routes that we follow. Perhaps at lunch we walk to the food carts on the corner or down the street. We might scan the road for traffic or keep our eyes glued to the pavement to keep our footing. Only rarely do we look up at the buildings that surround us. But if you chance to look up, let your eyes take in the beauty in the details of those buildings. Your soul might just soar at the sight of eagles poised for flight, winged horses in full career, or cherubs smiling in good cheer. Your confidence in America's democratic and commercial institutions might just be a bit stronger at the sight of those solid, towering Ionic columns guarding the gates to our governmental bodies and entrances to our financial establishments. Many of our downtown buildings are graced with classical elements. Did you know that many of these buildings were designed by architects of great national and international reputation? Tonight, we hope you will learn something about those classical details and about the buildings they so beautifully adorn. And perhaps you will also gain a greater appreciation for downtown's historic built environment and what it contributes to our capital city, to our governmental and business institutions, and to us as individuals. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to Dominion for their sponsorship of this lecture series. Thank you to the branch for allowing us to enjoy this beautiful historic space. We are incredibly grateful to have friends like you. And now let me introduce tonight's speaker. Calder Loth is the retired senior architectural historian of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, where he was employed for 40 years and still serves part-time. Among his current activities is teaching architectural literacy for the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art in New York and other venues. He also serves as the president of the Center for Palladian Studies in America. His publications include the Virginia Landmarks Register, Virginia Landmarks of Black History, and Lost Virginia, Vanished Architecture of the Old Dominion. In 2008, he was the first recipient of the Secretary of the Interior's Preservation Award for service to state preservation programs. In 2010 through 11, he served as a co-curator of the Royal Institute of British Architecture's exhibition, Palladio and His Legacy, A Transatlantic Journey, and was the author of Congressional Resolution number 259, honoring the 500th anniversary of Palladio's birth. Calder has lived in the Fan District since 1968, where he gardens as a pastime. After the discussion, there will be a few minutes for questions, and we hope that you will join us for a reception in the hallway following the program. And now, please give Calder a warm Richmond welcome.
Thank you, Simon. I think that congressional resolution was the last one that was passed unanimously. And, well, thank you also for giving me this opportunity to share with you the many architectural delights in our downtown. Our downtown is a rich garden of classical architecture, with many details that can be traced back to specific ancient sources, and many of which have interesting stories to tell, as we shall see. Now, for any discussion of Richmond's architecture, we need to start with our much heralded state capitol by Thomas Jefferson, our city's first and in many ways our foremost work of classical architecture. Now, as many of you know, the Virginia State Capitol was inspired by a specific Roman temple, the Maison Carrée in southern France. Here we see it in an illustration that appeared in a book which was owned by Thomas Jefferson, the Antiquities of France by Charles Claireaux. And when Jefferson was in France, he met Charles Claireaux, and it was about that time that he got the orders from the General Assembly to help with the design of our state capitol. And he worked with Claireaux to come up with that design. Now, the state capitol is not a copy of the Maison Carrée. It is inspired by it. Jefferson was familiar with this temple not only through Palladio and through Antiquities of France, but in his discussions with Charles Claireaux. We got to know it well. And this is the most perfect example of classical architecture, most perfectly preserved, survived from ancient times. So this inspired the Capitol, but it is not a copy. The Capitol is not a copy of it. And here is the Maison Carrée. Today, much of Jefferson saw it. And incidentally, he really didn't see this building until after he and Claireaux worked up the design for the Capitol and the model and sent it to Richmond for the builders here. But in his last year in France, he was able to see this, and as we heard his famous quote, he sat looking at it for hours like a lover at his mistress. It was the first real important piece of classical architecture that he ever saw. Now, as you can see, it's a very small building and a very elaborate building architecturally. The Capitol is a very large building in comparison, twice the size of the Maison Carrée, and much simpler in its architecture. Jefferson rightly knew that nobody in Richmond knew how to carve those fancy Corinthian capitals, so he simplified the order and made them Ionic. Okay, what does the Capitol really mean? I think we have to realize what a highly significant building this is as a work of classical architecture. It marked the first time that representative government was given specific architectural expression, the first time anyone, using the ancient temple form to create a temple of democracy. And it marked the birth of the classical revival movement in America. And most importantly, I think, it established the precedent of using monumental classicism for government and institutional architecture. How many state capitals, how many institutional buildings, collegiate buildings, government office buildings are inspired by this monumental classicism? And we can trace that all back to Jefferson's Capitol. It set the precedent for that, creating this image. America, particularly the late 19th century, thought of ourselves as a new Rome, an empire for liberty, and adopted the classical image for our own. Now, I want to jump from our oldest classical work of architecture in Richmond to one of our most recent ones, the new Bank Street entrance to the Capitol, which has an interesting story behind it. I served on the Architectural Advisory Committee for the restoration of the Capitol and worked with the architect, Dr. George Gomez. And they came up with a design for the Bank Street entrance, modern. And I looked at it and I said, well, it looks more like a bus stop or even a public toilet than it does. I said, George, I want to take you out of the country to show you something that might inspire you on this. Now, he's Greek, so he understood what I was talking about. So I took him about Richmond, his great Jeffersonian plantation house. Not designed by Jefferson, designed by Jefferson's best workman, an architect, John Nielsen, in the Jeffersonian spirit. Now, General Kopp, for whom this was built, was a great believer in the temperance movement. You have to remember that in the early 19th century, people drank bourbon to quench thirst. And it was very hard to get a business done because people were drunk all the time. So, Kopp was very much involved with the temperance movement, encouraged people to drink water rather than bourbon. Now, the James River Canal passed right down below the hill from this mansion. And here are all the canal people coming back and forth, all drunk all the time, drinking bourbon. So General Kopp decided he was really going to entice them into drinking water. So he built down at the foot of the hill, that's Remo up on the hill behind it, a temple of temperance against the canal, and over a wonderful spring of fresh water. Out from this temple flowed this water into a pool. So Kopp thought when they came up and saw this wonderful water, they would not want to drink bourbon, didn't want to drink the water. Well, he didn't realize that in that pool was a wonderful mint beer. So when they came up on the canal with their glass of bourbon and they saw this wonderful fresh spring water, all this mint, they put two and two together. But anyway, you can see that Temperance Temple is a lovely little building designed by one of America's foremost architects, Alexander Jackson Davis. Also designed BMI and a number of other great buildings. A little classical building, but it comes from an ancient precedent, which is no longer standing, and it was in the face of the Acropolis here, or in the side of it, and it was the Choragic monument of Thrasylus. Thrasylus had a good choral group. Choragic just means choral. And he won the prize, and they built this little monument honoring him, and the trophy sat up there where this statue later was put. Now, the Choragic monument of Thrasylus does not survive. It was completely destroyed sometime in the early 19th century. But enough of it was left in the 18th century for the great architects, James Stewart and Nicholas Woodvet, to do restoration drawings of it, showing what it must have looked like originally. With this interesting broken parapet here, showing the steps in the middle, just as we saw on the temple. This was inspired by the rest, although this has a center here where the Temperance Temple had two Doric columns instead. So, as I say, this temple doesn't, or this monument doesn't survive. This is where it was. It's just a hole in the side of the Acropolis. That's the Parthenon up on the top of the Acropolis. But we use that as inspiration because it had this Jeffersonian connection, and it had this connection to classicism, particularly Greek classicism, which Gomez was familiar with. So we like to say that this entrance to the Capitol, the Bank Street entrance, relates to Jefferson's temple on the hill as the Temperance Temple at Remo relates to the mansion, Jeffersonian mansion on the hill, as the Karadzic monument for Priscilla related to the Parthenon on the hill. In other words, this has good DNA. And also, what is good about it is, it forces people to come down and see the Capitol as Jefferson intended it to be seen, as the temple on the hill. Prior to this, tourists just went in the back door of the Capitol, didn't realize many of the Capitol was even on a hill or even had a portico on it. Okay, let's continue around Capitol Square and look at the entrance to the Washington Building, the tall building down in the corner, which Mary Winfield Scott called the corner cupboard. But it has a very interesting entrance motif here with Roman Ionic columns. So let's look closely at those column capitals. They are what we call parallel volutes. A volute is a spiral, probably inspired originally by a ram's horn. And volute just means, it comes from the same root where we get revolve, revolution, evolution, and so forth. So we have a pair of volutes in front and a pair of volutes in back. Volutes. Well, that is the standard form of ancient Roman Ionic capitals. And we see a very good example, almost identical to that, on the Washington Building, on this one temple surviving in Rome, near the Tiber River, temple of Fortunus. Fortunus was the god of the harbor, it was right next to the river. It had been later turned into a church, but it survives in very good condition. It's Roman Republic, not imperial, but we see an Ionic capital nearly identical to that on the Washington Building. This is the ancient precedent for this sort of thing. Now, let's go to another building on Capitol Square, the Oliver Hill Building, 1894, designed by an architect named William Poindexter. Poindexter was also the architect for the main building that is now Randolph College. It was Randolph Macon Women's College in Lynchburg, the late Victorian building. But he used the classical portico on this building. But if we look closely at it, we see Ionic capitals that are slightly different. Instead of parallel volutes, they come out at a diagonal. We call them diagonal or angle volutes. Well, they were not common in ancient times, but there were a couple of examples of that. So let's go back and see where they came from. But to do that, we have to talk about this guy, Vincenzo Scamozzi. Scamozzi was a student of Andrea Palladio's, and he also became a partner with him. And later on, he wanted to write his own treatise on classical architecture. So like Palladio, he went around Rome looking for ancient examples that he could include in his treatise. And we're pretty sure that he went into this early Christian church, Santa Maria in Trastevere in Rome. And like so many of those early Christian churches, it's built of what we call spoiler. In other words, fragments taken from ancient buildings and reused. In other words, they just go into columns or us and pick what they needed and So we're pretty sure that Scamozzi went inside his church and saw two columns, both of which have Ionic volutes set on a diagonal. And scholars are pretty sure that these were nipped from the beds of Caracalla, which was nearby. So Scamozzi was very taken with this model and included in his treatise Ionic capitals with diagonal volutes, and they are the only ones that he included, only variety of Ionic capitals that he included in his treatise. And they became very popular, mainly because they look good from any angle. And we see that happening with the capital. Now Jefferson, being a good Palladian, used Palladio for a source, but Palladio only showed parallel volutes. So in his original scheme for the capital, he was going to use parallel volutes. So that meant that the volutes would face forward on the front, but what happens when you get to the side? So in working with Clarisone, and I'm paraphrasing, here. He was perplexed about this, and so Clariso came and said, Tom, you know, if you use parallel it's not going to work very well, because are you going to have these facing this way, or that way, or these facing the front? You know, it's going to get very confusing. Why don't you use schematics? So Jefferson wrote later on, he says, I yielded with reluctance to the taste of Clariso in his preference for the modern capital of Scamozzi to the more noble capital of antiquity. So we have on our capital Scamozzi type diagram including an ionic order. Jefferson was a little wrong because Scamozzi's capitals were not modern. Scamozzi used an ancient precedent, which we just saw in the beds of Caracalla. All right, we're going over to the governor's mansion, and we see a different type of capital there on the portico. Capitol was designed by Alexander Paris, built in 1813, but the portico was added later in the 1830s, and it's very specific capitals. One row of acanthus leaves was palm fronds sticking out of it. We call that the Tower of the Winds order, because it comes from a very specific source in Greece, in the Roman agora in Athens. There's a building called the Tower of the Winds, and it had these capitals on it. You see one row of acanthus leaves with some palm fronds coming from them. This also was recorded by Stewart and Revere and published in the mid-18th century. And it's amazing how this one illustration here has inspired thousands and thousands of versions of this capital. There are plenty of them here in Richmond. You can go over to Beck's office and buy them today if you want, and stick them on your porch. But here is the Tower of the Winds, showing it as it must have looked originally when Stewart and Revere recorded. And it's named Tower of the Winds because of these big sculptures of the various winds in the frieze. And you see it had these two dwarf porticos with two of those capitals for each portico. Now, here is the Tower of the Winds today. It's lost the little dwarf porticos, but one of the capitals is preserved in this cage, which is sitting over here beside the Tower of the Winds. Otherwise, it's in pretty good condition. This is the Acropolis up behind it. That's the Erection peeping over the edge. That yellow house is where Millennium Mercury lived at one time. Okay, so we have the Tower of the Winds capitals on the governor's mansion. This was very popular for domestic buildings because the Tower of the Winds had the elegance of the Corinthian order, but it wasn't so elaborate. So it's better for dwellings rather than public buildings. Now let's go back to the Tower of the Winds, and we see it's an octagonal building with a faceted conical roof. Now what we don't realize that we had the Tower of the Winds at one time in downtown Richmond, a filming station at 6th and Marshall. And here are photographs. The photographs the magazine built in, 1929 or so. This parking deck on the summit. Long gone, unfortunately. It's a wonderful little landmark. But don't worry, we have a version of it still in downtown Richmond with the convention center. So now you can take great comfort when you're driving down Broad Street. You do still have a version of the Tower of the Winds downtown Richmond. They say architectural historians have more fun than anybody. You can always be amused by driving around any city and seeing references. All right, we come to a great work of classical architecture on Capitol Square. The General Assembly building, originally built as an insurance company, the Life of Virginia company, used a big neon sign on top of it. Big, wonderful classical facade, with all sorts of things going on in it. Designed by a very interesting architect, a Brit, named Alfred Bossum, who was educated in Britain, came to this country in 1905, worked in New York for a big firm called Clinton & Russell. He did wonderful classical work all over the country. A number of works right here in Richmond. Now, Bossum was an interesting person. He worked as an architect up until 1926 when he returned to England and gave up architecture and got into politics and got into Parliament. And in 1953, he became a mentor to a young aspiring lady who was getting interested in politics and actually gave her away in marriage. It was Margaret Thatcher. And in 1960, he became a life peer, Baron Bossum of Maidstone. Interesting, when Winston Churchill first heard that this architect was in the Houses of Parliament, and he said to one of his colleagues, Bossum, that's an interesting name. Neither one thing or the other. Anyway, Bossum was a good classicist. And I can't document it, but I think he surely must have been familiar and inspired by Palladio's Palazzo Valmarana in Vicenza, with these tall Corinthian pilasters on a high basement, big prominent entablature with an attic above it. I think they're just too close to be coincidental. And it has wonderful details on it, like these, what we call Pegasus capitals. Pegasus is a mythological winged horse. And it's a symbol of wisdom and fame. And I hope the members of the General Assembly take note of that. But these can be traced back to a very specific ancient source, the temple of Mars Ultor, ruins of which are near the Forum in Rome today. And those capitals were first recorded, they were on a colonnade that extended from the temple, main temple body. They were first recorded by Palladio. And here they are appearing in his book, Facta Libre, published in 1570. And one of those capitals survives, and it's on display in the Capitoline Museum in Rome today, looking very much like what we have the General Assembly building. All right, let's look at another interesting detail of the General Assembly building. We go around on the Broad Street side. These are metal panels between the windows. And they have these wavy lines in them, and they are called stridulation. I'm sure everybody's heard of stridulation. Where does that come from? Well, for whatever reason, it was a very popular decoration for Roman sarcophagi. But that's not the ultimate source for this wavy form. It comes from the name of the knife blade that Greek athletes used when they would cook themselves with olive oil, and then to clean themselves, they would use this curvy blade to scrape the olive oil off of their skin. And if you go to the Virginia Museum, we have an actual Greek strigil on display there. You see it has exactly the same wavy curve that we saw on the General Assembly building. Stridulation. Really esoteric, but fun for teeth. And in the windows of the General Assembly building, up on the second floor, we have balustrades with what we call double balusters. That means it's vertically symmetrical. In other words, it has a bulbous portion on top and a bulbous portion on the bottom, called double balusters. Now, contrary to popular belief, balusters were never used by ancient Romans. It's a Renaissance invention. And one of the earliest examples of double balusters is on this wonderful building in a courtyard in Rome, very early, 1502, by Donato Bramante, the Tempietto. It's a memorial building built what they thought was the site of the crucifixion of St. Peter. But we see double balusters going around the front with the dome. And here is Palladio's illustration of the Tempietto, and you see these double balusters. Now, double balusters are very common. We think that the source for the design may have been inspired by ancient Roman candlesticks. And we see that form in Roman candlesticks as displayed on the frieze of the Temple of Fortunatus, which I showed earlier. That may be the inspiration for this form. Not sure. Anyway, they are very common. I actually have double balusters on my own front porch. So when I'm sitting there with my friends having a drink and the conversation rolls, I can say, well, you know, I've got double balusters over there. Remontes Tempietto in Rome, and crucifixions, and we think the precedent for that may have been the candlesticks as shown on the frieze of the temple. By that time, we're so lazy. We get a refilled gloves and get on with it. All right. Probably we're more familiar with single balusters. That's you have what just is the bulbous portion, or what's it called, the belt, just in one section of the baluster. And here we see a good example of that on the parapet on the Wickham Valentine house. And here is a more familiar, the back form of the single baluster shown on a Renaissance bridge in Vicenza, dating from the 1620s. The source for that we also think may be Roman candlesticks, as shown in this illustration of an ancient Roman candlestick by Caronese. Now, the term baluster comes from the Italian word balastro, which is the Italian term for the bud of the pomegranate flower. And you see it has that baluster shape there. So next time you go ahead and look at your pomegranate bush, you will know something about it. All right. Here are the Corinthian capitals on the General Assembly building with big eagles up here. Now that's not just a patriotic gesture, could be, but we can trace that back to a specific ancient source, and that is this building in Rome called the Portico of Octavian. Pretty beat up, but enough of the capital was left for some of the Renaissance architects to be able to make restoration drawings of it, and you see that it does have eagles on it as well. This was a book by a French architect, worker Louis XIV, called Day. A book was undoubtedly my boss was familiar with, standard book, source book on classical architecture. But the eagle is also a symbol of the Roman Empire as well. Now, the more standard Corinthian capital we see on another Basel building, the First National Bank building. Of course, this is the most elaborate of the classical orders. 2 rows of acanthus, well, 3 rows of acanthus leaves with these stems coming out of the leaves called calicoid. This is a fancy word for stem, where we get broccoli even. So the origin of the Corinthian capital is an interesting legend behind it. It's just a legend, which was written up by Vitruvius. Now, Vitruvius was an architect who worked in the time of Caesar Augustus, and his treatise on architecture is the only one that we have surviving from ancient times. And Vitruvius said that in the town of Corinth in Greece, a wealthy patrician young lady died, and her maidservant was so upset by her death that she wanted to honor her in a certain way. So she gathered up all her favorite possessions in a basket and put them on her grave. But she didn't realize that she had put them on the root of an acanthus plant. Acanthus plant is kind of a weed in the Mediterranean, and the plant grew up around that basket. And along came this poet and an artist named Calder, and he thought this was so beautiful that he drew it up, and that was the origin of the Corinthian capital, which we see here. And the acanthus plant was long considered, or the acanthus leaf, or plant was considered a symbol of regeneration, because out of this simple root comes this wonderful, rich, lush plant. Regeneration. So the origin of the Corinthian order. All right, we're back on Capitol Square here. I serve on the State Art and Architectural Review Board, and we have to review the design of any new state building, collegiate, government building, whatever. And they wanted to add to the rear of the Oliver Hill building. Now, the Oliver Hill building is now the Department of Agriculture, State Department of Agriculture. And this was the design that was presented for that addition. Now, the Governor's Mansion is right up here. This is Bank Street right down here. And I said, well, you know, you're almost there, but this looks more like something that ought to be out at Innsbruck rather than on Capitol Square. to juice it up a little bit. Well, a couple of things I like. I like the bow here, but I figured that needs some more interest on it. And I like the way they broke the cornice up here and had this gable up there, but with a not very interesting little round window. So I was saying, where can I find something like this that I can show the architects that they can use as a model? I thought, and I thought, I know, Blenheim Palace. But here the gable works much the same way. You bring it forward, and then you break it, and then you put the main gable behind it. And you can't see it here, but there's a special window that I'll talk about in a minute. So I told the architects, and I said, all right, why not? So that's the result, based on more or less Blenheim Palace. And pilasters here instead of just those strips, and the cornice got a little more interesting. But I rationalize this in saying, well, this is a Department of Agriculture, and our traditionally most important agricultural product was tobacco. And of course, Blenheim Palace is at home to the Duke of Marlborough, and of course, there you go. Anyway, we used a special kind of window up here called a Diocletian window. Why do we call it the Diocletian window? Well, it comes from the beds of Diocletian in huge buildings, still surviving in Rome, now converted into a church. Unfortunately, all the classical decoration has been stripped off of it. You see little bits of it surviving here and there, but its main defining feature are these huge semicircular windows with two big vertical mullions, much as we see up here. So Diocletian windows, and that's a fairly common classical motif. And with the recent restoration of the building on Broad Street by VCU, we revealed another Diocletian window in Richmond, and that's this former railroad station on Broad Street, which had all been covered with horrible metal panelings of the glass company, but all of that paneling was stripped off, and it revealed here a Diocletian window in the arch there. So we got another one in the process. All right, let's look at this Memorial Hospital building just around the corner from Capitol Square. Interesting building with a lot of classical decoration on it. I want to point out one motif, and that's this elongated bracket or console supporting the cornice here. Now, console comes from the same root that we get the word console. If you console somebody, you give them emotional support. A console is architectural support. So, where does the console come from? Well, we have to go back to the Temple of Fortunus. It was also called the Temple of Fortunaveros, but we now know it's Temple of Fortunus. And this is the drawing by Palladio. We show hiding behind the column here is the doorway. You see just a little bit of a console supporting the cornice there. So we have to look at another drawing by Palladio and decide to see the design of this console here. Very standard design. Consoles are very common. This is certainly not the only one from ancient times. The Greeks actually used them, not too different from this. But this drawing, I think, was the source for many of them, because Palladio's book was used as a textbook by architects for years. And if we compare this with the console on the Memorial Hospital, we see they're nearly identical. Consoles are everywhere. You've got all over the Bangor Street, on Monument Avenue, downtown. Here's a very elaborate console on the General Assembly building. All right. We're going down Broad Street and looking at the Vidal building. Really interesting building by Carneal and Johnson, done in the 1930s. What we call strict classicism. In other words, we're getting it down to the basic form of classical building with very minimal ornament. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, this is fascist architecture. This is what Hitler and Mussolini were doing. Well, they were, but everybody was doing it. They were doing this in Britain, they were doing it in France, they were doing it in America. This is a very good example of this sort of thing. But it has some interesting detailing on it, which comes from Greek precedent. Look at these very simple capitals here, but with these scrolls and these Anthemian motifs here looking very similar to what you see on a fragment of a Greek architectural work in Delphi in Greece. The ends of those scrolls have been broken off, but you see a very similar type of decoration. And that simple Greek form was the inspiration for some of the strict classicism. And out in front, we have these very beautiful bronze tripods, which were the forms of ancient braziers, which gave off heat and light. Sometimes they're actually used as altars. But they were a fairly common device in ancient Rome, and we see an illustration of this sort of thing by Piranesi again. So, beautiful kind of detailing on these buildings. I mean, we just don't do that much of it anymore. We have 3,000 years of accumulated architectural knowledge to use, and so much we start with a clean slate and don't realize that we have wonderful sources to draw from. Now, we go across the street to Monumental Church, familiar to all of you, but it has very distinctive capitals on the portico. We see here these Greek Doric columns, which are fluted at top and fluted at bottom, but not in the middle. What's going on? Why did they finish the columns? Why didn't they flute them all the way? Well, Robert Mills was familiar with Stuart and Rivette's book. In fact, he said when he first saw it, it marked the beginning of his architectural career. It really turned him on. And in Stuart and Rivette's book, we have this drawing of the columns of the Temple of Apollo at Delos. And we see that it fluted at the bottom and fluted at the top, but not in the middle. Stuart and Rivette surmised that this is because perhaps these columns were draped during ceremonies, and you didn't need to flute them, because they'd be covered up. Scholars now say, more likely, they just never finished them. So the way you flute the columns, you do it in place. You start at the bottom, you start at the top, and hopefully beat in the middle. They've inspired any number of examples of this sort of thing. All right, let's go over to the edge of Capitol Square, St. Paul's Church, a wonderful Greek revival building, and we see very distinctive Corinthian capitals. Again, we go back to Stuart and Rivette for not the Roman type of Corinthian capital, which we saw earlier on the First National Bank building, but the Greek version of the Corinthian order, which is, I think, much more voluptuous. It has a lot more movement. But instead of 2 or 3 rows of acanthus leaves, it has one major row interspersed with these flowers. And then below that, just a row of very simple olive leaves, or just olive or laurel leaves. And we see it copied almost identically in the capitals of St. Paul's Church. And they come from a very specific source, from this little monument at the base of the Acropolis called the Heraldic Monument of Lysicrates. Now, Lysicrates, like Thrasyllis, had a choral group, and they won the prize, which was a bronze trophy that sat way up on the top of this elaborate figure here. And you can see that this is a very small monument. Here's a person standing right here. It's right down at the base of the Acropolis. Probably we've been to Athens, you've seen this here. But this particular type of capital is unique to this monument. You won't find it on any other example of ancient Greek architecture. And we're pleased to have a wonderful representation of it right here in Richmond. Now, the capitals on the Heraldic Monument of the Lysicrates are pretty beat up. But enough is left for them to do accurate drawings of it, but ours are never going to wear it because they're cast iron. All right, we go down on Main Street to look at another Alpenfossen building, the former Virginia Trust Company, in the form of a Roman triumphal arch. That was a very popular form, particularly for banks, because it gave you a sense of permanence and stability and dignity. And of course, the main source for these single arch triumphal arches is the Arch of Titus, still standing in the Roman Forum. Now, interesting detail on the Arch of Titus is the keystone. Now, it's in the form of the scroll console, but it's wide and used as a keystone. And it's decorated with a little figure of a god. And unfortunately, the head has been knocked off because the early Christians went around in Rome knocking the heads off of any Roman statue they could find because they were all symbols they thought of paganism. We got to be careful about knocking the heads off of some of our statues here. Anyway, interestingly, if we go look at the Vineyard Trust Company building, we see a nearly identical keystone with a figure on it, and her head's been knocked off. Now, I don't know whether Bossum was a strict antiquarian and tried being literal with the Arch of Titus, or whether this got knocked off later. But how many of you noticed this missing head? Okay, so I'm going to look for it next time you want Main Street. And across the street, another Clinton and Russell building, possibly a work on the Alfred Dawson. You see this lovely detail of a winged cupid with all of this floral decoration coming out of it like a mermaid here. And again, that can be traced back to an ancient source, to the temple of Jupiter. Now, David Day thought this was a temple of Nero. We know that's not true now. It's the temple of Jupiter, which does not survive. It was up on the Quernale Hill, where lots of Quernale is now the home of the president of Italy, formerly home of the king of Italy, formerly, well, it was still a wonderful Renaissance thing, but fragments of the temple of Jupiter survived, and you see the winged Cupid here with foliage coming all out of it, very similar to what you have here. All right. Now we go to an interesting building, kind of strict classicism at East Franklin Street, the Imperial Building, formerly headquarters of the Imperial Tobacco Company. Now, I'm not sure what goes on in there. By a Norfolk firm, Neff and Thompson. Clarence Neff was quite a prolific architect who designed, of all things, the Country Club of Virginia and the Cavalier Hotel. But he also did this strict classical building in Richmond. And what I want to point out is this frieze band up here, this little band of decoration. And we have to go up close to it and see it's in the form of a Greek fret or meander, which is a symbol of unity and infinity. And this is a particularly elaborate one when all of these lines meet in the center. It forms a kind of swastika here. That can be traced back to a specific ancient source. We have to go back to the temple of Mars Ultor, again, in the form of Augustus. A bit of it survives, and if we look up at the soffit of the colonnade, we see exactly that same type of Greek fret, which was recorded by Andrea Palladio in Quattro Libre in 1570. And as I say, this book was used as a textbook by architects all up into the 20th century, so you see this motif fairly often. And also, it got into all the English pattern books in the 18th century, many of which were used here in the United States. So you see it, as we can see, in some specific colonial examples. Anyway, Palladio wasn't the first to notice this. Actually, it was noticed by, of all people, Raphael, who included the motif in this soffit of this arch in his famous fresco of the School of Athens, which is in the Vatican Palace. But we have it all placed in the dining room, or not the dining room, the main bed, first floor bedroom of Shirley. This same fresco. This was probably taken from one of the English pattern books of the period, not from Palladio. Late example of it is in the classical courtyard of the Virginia Museum. All right, and we go back down to Main Street and we see an example of what we call rustication on this entrance to what was formerly a bank. Rustication means these big square blocks interrupting the shaft of the column to make it look like it's not quite finished. They haven't carved it all out. It's still in the process of being constructed, just to give it some virility, some movement to show that this is a serious building. In other words, if you didn't have these blocks, if you didn't have rustication, it would look too domestic. It would look like the doorway on a house rather than a strong, virile doorway on a bank. Rustication is very popular. It was mainly popularized by an British architect named James Gibbs, who did a pattern book on his architectural design that was widely used in this country in the colonial period. And one of Gibbs's most famous buildings is this church on Trafalgar Square, right in the heart of London, St. Martin in the Field. And you can see he's put rustication on every single opening of St. Martin's. And we see it on this doorway here, rustication interrupting the frame of this doorway. And in fact, in England today, this type of doorway with these blocks on it is referred to as a Gibbs door or a Gibbs opening. Now, Gibbs didn't invent this. We can trace it back to Palladio. We can see it used on his design for the Palazzo Tiene in Vicenza. Really tough looking here. This building has got a lot of forbidden quality about it. I mean, the Prince Tiene wanted to show that this was a very serious building. But you can trace rustication all the way back to ancient Rome, as we see on this drawing of the Roman amphitheater in Verona. To get a look of solidity, to show that this is a very strongly constructed building. Okay, rustication. Now, I want to talk a bit about this architect, Giacomo Vignola. He was a contemporary of Palladio's, and he wrote his own treatise on the classical orders. It's a gripping title called The Canon of the Five Orders of Architecture. Now, came out in, 1562. Now, Vignola's treatise was used by most continental architects, particularly in France, for classical design, whereas Palladio was more popular for the English architects. And since many of our architects in the late 19th century studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in France, they learned their orders from Vignola rather than from Palladio. Slightly different. Now, in the back of Vignola's book, he showed this illustration here. Now, this is not an example from a specific classical source. It's his own invention. He says over here, and this is roughly translated from the Italian, I have used this cornice successfully in my work on the upper parts of facades. Although it is my invention, I do not find it inappropriate to place it at the end of this work with those who want to use it. Well, what do we have? We have a standard Corinthian cornice up here with scroll modillions with acanthus leaves under them. But to give this whole entablature more height, he's made the frieze deeper by using these console forms, or these modillions, elongated and turned vertically, just to make this whole thing taller. As he said, for use on the upper parts of facades. So we have to look at one of Vignola's buildings to see what he's talking about. This is the Villa Farnese at Calder Loth, way up in the mountains above Rome. An enormous building. But if he'd done a standard entablature here relating to this order on the upper floors, it just wouldn't be strong enough with this enormous facade. He had to do something taller. So he's using his invention, what we now call the bracketed cornice. And that became very popular, used in Renaissance buildings, and particularly picked up in the 19th century on Italianate or Italian style buildings. Or even in the early 20th century, you have to go down to the YWCA in downtown Richmond on what's it, this street. Our own palazzo here in Baskerville, and if we look up closely, we see that it has a Vignola type bracketed cornice. We look closely at it, it's almost exactly like that plate in Vignola's book here. In other words, Baskerville. I'm sure they had a copy of Vignola, probably studied it in school. So they're using this motif to give some height, to give some importance overall to this facade here. But as I say, this was very popular in the 19th century. You get all sorts of versions of it on what we call Italianate style buildings, such as the bowling Haxon House. But this is a bit stylized here, but this is where it's coming from. It's coming from that specific plate in Vignola's book. All right, let's look at another example of Vignola's influence, what we call the mutual door. Here is an entablature with column capital on what was the former Chamber of Commerce building on Main Street. I think, what is it, 4th Street or so, on the corner there. It used to be called the Eskimo Pie Building, was the Eskimo Pie Company. But you see here what we call the mutual Doric orders. Now these are mutual blocks, and you see all these doodads under them called gutai. Gutai is the Latin word for a prop. Now hold that thought, I'll explain it in a minute. And we also see the capital here with this building here called the Achaeans decorated with eggs and darts. And we see the necking of the capital with some decorations in it. All right, we have to go to Vignola to see where it's coming from. Here is the mutual version of the Doric order. These big mutual blocks creating a very deep soffit under the cornice here. And here we have the capital treated almost the same way as we see on the Eskimo Pie building. Well, what is it? Mutual. Well, it's been said, and there's some truth to it, that classical architecture is which is stone, is a sculptural representation of wooden construction. So here is a diagram of what they think might have been the wooden construction form of what became the Doric order. And a mutual comes from the Etruscan word meaning an extension. So it is just an extension of the roof rafters coming down, sticking out over the over the top of these brackets here called triglifes. And the edges are projecting, and the gutai are the wooden pegs that are all holding it in place. 36 of them. Well, here are, that's standard, 36 of them here. Vignola said he got this form not from a specific temple, but just from fragments that he found lying around in Rome, and grew up this order from it. But it's been very influential. You see examples of it. Sometimes with gutai, sometimes not. Monument Avenue, other classical buildings, all over, everywhere. Post office, whatnot. Even down on the neutral building, that's not a fine, well, false fine. It comes from a different source. But anyway, this only has, what, 18 gutai in it rather than 36. A little more shallow neutral blocks here. But the capital is treated pretty much the same way as we know it did. All right, coming into the close, we see in the windows of the Supreme Court building, formerly the Federal Reserve building, what we call Roman lattice, or sometimes called transcendent. Now, as I said, the Romans didn't have balusters. If they wanted to do railings, they would use what we call Roman lattice, this crisscross shaped business, and they also used it to fill in big openings like this. This was a conjectural restoration of a big Roman bath. And here we see an actual fragment of this Roman lattice, again on display in the Church of San Antonio Trastevere, done in marble. Sometimes this was done for window openings. Sometimes these voids were filled in, sometimes not, just for ventilation. It could be filled in with alabaster, or thin sheets of alabaster, or mica, or some primitive glass. Here's an early example of this sort of thing in an early Christian church, San Giorgio in Milan, and this has a primitive form of glass in it. But we see this kind of thing all over the place. Here are the windows on the Colonial Theater building by Carnegie and Johnson, dating from 1919. They were good classically trained architects. Here we have the beautiful bronze railing of it on the former Bank of Virginia building, now being converted into apartments down on, what is it, 8th and Main. Beautiful example of this type of thing. And a more recent thing, this was a redo of a modern style building near 5th and Main. but they've gone back and used this Roman lattice motif as decoration between the windows. It's very common. Look at the stable doors at Maymont. There's nothing but Roman lattice there. All right. Here we have on the Virginia building, which is next door to Second Presbyterian Church, this wonderful doorway with what we call banded columns, not rusticated, but banded columns. And the source for that is not so much ancient, but French Renaissance. And we have to go to the Tuileries Palace in France to see this sort of thing. Now, the Tuileries Palace was the main royal palace for the kings of France and later for Napoleon. And it closed the open arms of the Louvre. You know, the Louvre goes out like this, but the Tuileries went across the end there. And unfortunately, in the Commune uprising in Paris in 1870, the Tuileries Palace was burned. It was left a shell, and the ruins were completely destroyed. Now, there are fragments of it surviving, and we have to go to the sculpture courtyard of the Louvre to find an example of these banded columns, salvaged from the Tuileries Palace. Here we have them here. And to go to another portion of the Louvre to see another example of these banded columns, almost identical to what we have on the Virginia building next to the Second Presbyterian Church, but it's coming from this French Renaissance source. Now, interestingly, we go back to the Louvre, we see this rustication, the keystones and the blocks here, done with this strange, curvy, carved business, squirmy stuff called vermiculation. Vermiculation. And we have examples of vermiculation in Richmond. Here we have it on the Colonial Theater building. I don't know whether it was used by ancient Romans, but it was certainly used during the Renaissance. And also, it's the term sort of we use for this stuff. Vermiculation just means worms. And of course, this looks like a plate of worms. And of course, that looks like a bunch of worms too. Vermiculation. All right. A favorite device of mine called the paddle. Here we see it going around the Quirk Hotel. Wonderful classical building, and this is a circular disc-like shape with a button in the middle. Paddle. A paddle in ancient times was a very shallow plate, which was used in ceremonies of sacrifice. Here we see, this is our Pachas in Rome. The guys, and of course the heads get knocked off by the Christians, they're leading the animal to be sacrificed. And here's the guy with the knife ready to cut the throat off the sheep here. And here's the guy with the wine sack here. There were sacred liquids, which they would pour into this shallow plate called a pateron. And that's where we get the term paten, in the little plate that we use for the communion bread. It's also the term we get it for this thing on my kneecap here, the patella bone that comes from that same ancient source, the pateron. Now notice how this guy is holding the pateron here. Now pateron became a very popular decorative device. Here is an actual bronze Roman pateron in these shallow dishes with a button in the middle. But here we see a stylized version of it in the end of this Roman sarcophagus with the button in the middle. This is in the Metropolitan Museum. Now let me go back to showing you how this guy is holding this. I have to bring a prop here. Imagine this as a pateron. Now, if this didn't have that button in the middle, it would be very hard to hold this thing like this. So they put that little button in the middle, this indentation, so you can anchor your thumb with it and hold it perfectly steady, like that. So that's the origin of the form of the pateron. Pateron are everywhere. Here we see them on the Wickham House. Then it uses these corner blocks with a button in the middle. And here we have them on the Cokesbury building, the former bookstore by Carnegie and Johnson. and do remember in my own living room in the Bank District. So I can turn around and say, you know, I've got symbols of ancient Roman sacrifices. And if you need a padlock picture, go to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy these things, a couple dollars, and use it in your door frame. Window frames, there's thousands and thousands and thousands. All right, I want to end now with a very interesting ancient detail, not surviving, unfortunately. This is the former Exchange Bank building, which was down on Main Street, where the Parcel Post building next to the, what used to be the post office, now the Courts building on Main Street, by Isaiah Rogers, famous Boston architect, did the Exchange Hotel here at Richmond. This building was, bank building was built in 1841, burned in 1865, rebuilt in 1865, rebuilt again in 1910. It was demolished in 1935. The fragments were saved and were put on the grounds of the Virginia Historical Society, where they thought they were going to erect a kind of little Roman garden feature, but they never got around to it, and the fragments, unfortunately, were ground up with gravel in 1959. So we have these photographs, but let's look closely at these capitals. They're sort of like the Tower of the Winds order, with one row of acanthus leaves, but with, instead of the palm fronds coming out of the top, we have much more elaborate amphibian-like devices, and they also come from a specific Roman, let's see, you can see them here, from a specific ancient source. And that's the Corinthian of the Temple of Apollo at near Miletus, which is in Asia Minor, across the Aegean Sea, now in Turkey. But you see very similar here to what we have on the Exchange Bank by Isaiah Rogers. Actually, we have one other building by Isaiah Rogers surviving in Richmond. That's Kent Valentine's house. It's been worked over, but the Gothic interiors are original Isaiah Rogers interiors. But this particular capital is very rare. I've seen only 2 other examples of it in this country. One is in Baltimore, on Mount Vernon Place, pretty beat up. But you don't have to go to Baltimore. You can just go up Main Street to the Historic Richmond Foundation, and there they are on the Capitol Portico there. So I want to mention, well, as some of you know, these columns were stolen while this building was under restoration. And my friend Jack Zimmer was driving down Carey Street one day and saw the column on either side of an entrance to a car repair shop. And he said, excuse me, those are our columns. I want them back. We won't make a fuss about them, just give them back. So they did. On the Historic Richmond Foundation. With a favorite quote of mine from Thomas Jefferson: "Architecture is my delight." And it certainly was Jefferson's delight. It certainly was Jack Zimmer's delight. And I think we owe both Jack Zimmer and Thomas Jefferson a big round of applause, because one, Thomas Jefferson gave us this great classical tradition in Richmond with our capital, and Jack did so much to preserve it and appreciate it. And I hope you realize that all of this stuff that I've shown you this evening is there for one reason, and one reason only. And that's for our delight. So if we don't know how to read the building, we're missing out so much. So again, I think we ought to give both Jack and Jefferson a big hand for helping us appreciate all of it. Thank you.
informative lecture. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate your supporting Historic Richmond and supporting programs like this. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you very much. Thank you to Calder. And please join us, unless you want to answer a few questions. Or, no. We're done.